Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to 1347. Picture this. The salty air of the Mediterranean clings to your skin as you stand on the docks of Messina, Sicily. Genoese trading ships, weather-beaten and crusted with sea salt, are gliding into the harbour. The ropes groan, the wood creaks, and the air smells of fish, sweat, and something off. You hear shouts in Italian, crates tumbling, and someone coughing violently. On board, things are not quite right. The sailors who disembark don't walk so much as stumble. Their faces are drawn, lips pale, and some of them have dark swellings on their necks or under their arms. You spot one man scratching furiously behind his ear, blinking at the sun like it's too bright, even though it's an overcast afternoon. He's not drunk, he's dying. You don't know it yet, but you're watching the start of something that will tear through continents, shift the balance of power in Europe, inspire medical superstition for centuries, and, in about 700 years, become a very popular YouTube sleep topic. The Black Death has arrived, and spoiler alert, it's not entirely the rat's fault, but we'll get to that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Back on the docks, you follow the groans of the porters unloading the Genoese ships. They're grumbling about the stench in the cargo hold, which smells like spoiled meat, wet wool, and something you can't quite place, something rotten and ancient. A rat scurries across the deck, fat and fearless. Another slips through a gap in the grain sack. You don't think much of it. Nobody does. That's the thing. In 1347, rats are just part of the scenery, like pigeons today, only with more tail and slightly better table manners. People don't blame them. Not yet. Most still think the plague is a punishment from above, or maybe from below, depending on your theology. As you trail one of the sailors into the town, the heat is stifling, the air hangs like damp wool, and the street is narrow, barely wide enough for 2 ox carts to pass. Laundry flaps above your head from one building to the next. Children run barefoot, and old women gossip at windowsills. But within days, things start to change. The coughing gets worse. People stop coming to the market. Doors get marked with crude red crosses. The town bell tolls more often and more solemnly. People whisper about ships bringing death. Here's the thing they don't understand, what nobody understands yet. What's coming doesn't just kill, it rearranges everything. Your town's population, your family's future, even the way people build cities. And yes, eventually, it ruins the rat's reputation forever. You stay close to a well-off merchant. Let's call him Matteo. Matteo is starting to feel a little feverish, but he's got a delivery to make. He walks with a limp, not from plague, just an old wine barrel injury. His cart squeaks behind him as he winds through the alleyways, the wooden wheels crunching over old straw, and, also over something that might have once been a cat. It's hard to tell. The streets haven't been cleaned in weeks. Matteo doesn't notice the tickle in his throat at first, or the tightness in his armpit. But by the time he's home and unlatching the door with a rusty key, he's blinking hard, sweating and stumbling. A little. His wife gasps. She's seen that look before, just yesterday, in the neighbour who collapsed while baking bread. Here's your mainstream historical fact of the night. The Black Death, also known as the Second Plague Pandemic, killed an estimated 30–60% of Europe's population in just a few years. It tore through communities like a forest fire in a hayfield, and for centuries we thought we knew how it worked. Rats carried fleas, fleas bit people, people died. Simple, right? But now for the quirky twist. In the original 1347 records, nobody blamed rats, not once. They blamed bad air, sinners, stars, even foreigners. One German town thought a talking goat was responsible. Historians still argue whether this lack of early rodent blame was ignorance, or if people just genuinely didn't see many rats dropping dead. And that's odd, right? If rats were the villains, wouldn't someone have noticed that they were dying too? Instead, the plague moves like wind through the town. You stand in a silent street where a few days ago vendors hawked garlic and dried figs. Now, shutters are closed. A body lies wrapped in linen in the gutter. You try not to breathe too deeply. The air feels thicker somehow. Matteo's house is dark. A priest murmurs outside the door, one hand gripping a crucifix, the other swatting away flies. Matteo didn't last long. Neither did his wife. You move through the quiet town. The laundry still flaps overhead, but no one is there to take it in. You pass the church. The graveyard is full, and they've started digging trenches in the orchard. The rats are still here. You see one nibbling an old crust of bread near the fountain. It doesn't look sick. In fact, it looks downright smug. That little guy, he's about to get centuries of bad PR. But the real story, that's just beginning. You step into the home of a baker's apprentice. It's dim, the air is thick with the lingering scent of yeast, charred crust, and a little something else, like wet leather and sour milk. A young boy, maybe 10 or 11, stares blankly from his cot near the hearth. He's flushed and restless, fingers twitching, and just behind his ear there's a little bump forming, hard to spot in the firelight. It itches, he scratches. A lot. That's all it is at first, a little itch. A tiny irritation, maybe a flea bite. He's had them before, who hasn't? But this one's different. By morning, the swelling is the size of a walnut. It's hot, angry looking, and tender to the touch. His mother presses a cloth to it, soaked in vinegar and herbs. Nothing helps. His fever climbs, and he mumbles nonsense about horses in the ceiling and a dancing man with no hands. His breath grows shallow. This is how it begins for most. Not with dramatic collapse or fountains of blood, just a little bump, the kind of thing you'd normally ignore. You wander through the town. Every third house has someone with a similar story. Behind one door, a blacksmith's wife is soaking in a wooden tub, whispering to herself as her fingers go numb. Behind another, a monk lies curled in a corner, his skin flushed purple. There's a quiet dread in the streets now. People have stopped ringing bells for the dead. There are simply too many. Coffins become optional. A cart trundles by, 4 bodies stacked like firewood, covered in a stained wool sheet. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The first symptoms of the Black Death, typically painful lymph node swellings called buboes, would appear 2 to 6 days after exposure. Victims usually died within 3 to 5 days, often in agony and often alone. Now, time for tonight's quirky tidbit. Some people believed you could sweat out the plague by wrapping yourself in onions, goat grease, and rose petals. One enterprising barber even tried leeches soaked in wine. Historians still argue whether these cures were acts of desperation, or if, somehow, 1 or 2 of them actually helped. Personally, I'd avoid the goat grease. In the candle-lit hush of the baker's home, the boy's breathing grows erratic. His mother clutches his hand and prays under her breath, not quite sure if she's addressing God or just the ceiling. There's a scraping sound outside, someone sharpening a shovel. She knows what that means. You don't stay to watch, you walk out into the night. Fog clings low to the ground, wrapping the cobblestones like silk. From a distance, the town looks deceptively peaceful, just quiet windows and the occasional barking dog. But closer in, every sound is muffled by dread. The baker, what was left of him, was taken 2 days ago. His flour is still in the mill. The loaves are moulding in their baskets. The rats, again, look remarkably fine. And now people are starting to notice that odd detail. You overhear a merchant muttering, "Shouldn't the rats be dying too?" Rats, after all, are everywhere. They eat your grain. They chew your shoes. They fall from rafters and skitter across rafters in the dark. But now that the people are dying by the thousands, the rats are still squeaking, still thriving. Some even look healthier. Fewer humans mean less competition for food. In the cramped quarters of a tenement near the city wall, a midwife tries to disinfect her hands with vinegar. She doesn't know about bacteria, nobody does, but she's seen enough disease to try something. She talks to herself while working. It's not the rats. It can't be the rats. I've had rats my whole life. This is something new, something angrier. Historians will spend centuries debating her hunch. In your slow walk through this withering city, you come across a small chapel with a curious mural. Painted just months before the plague hit, it shows a field of peasants harvesting wheat while angels look down from puffy comic book clouds. The peasants are smiling. That field is now a trench filled with nameless bodies. Nobody paints murals anymore. Back in the boy's home, the bump behind his ear has turned black. His lips are dry. His mother has stopped weeping and just holds him like she did when he was a baby, humming an old lullaby that sounds more like a dirge now. And still, the rats scratch in the walls. You find yourself wondering, why hasn't anyone questioned them yet? Are they just too normal, too ordinary to suspect? Or maybe everyone is too scared to look for blame in small things. It's easier to blame the stars, or God, or the foreigners across the water. But soon, that will change. The itch behind the ear, the swollen glands, the sudden collapse. All these signs will become familiar. And with familiarity comes fear, and with fear comes the desperate need for a scapegoat. You take one last look around the baker's quarters, at the empty sack of flour, the drying herbs above the fire, the cracked ceramic bowl still half full of water. The boy is gone. Outside, the rats squeak softly in the alley, their tails curling like ribbons across the moonlit stone. You wake to the sound of bells again. But this time, they're not for mass. It's early morning, and the town is already moving, though not in the usual way. The market stalls are half-built, some abandoned mid-setup. A fishmonger leaves a trail of scales and entrails as he drags his wares off the square without saying a word. You pass a woman clutching her child tightly. She's wrapped her face in a scarf soaked in rosemary water, hoping it'll ward off whatever is killing her neighbors. You follow the bell. It's mounted on a wooden cart, pulled slowly by a pair of weary oxen. Behind the cart, 2 men walk with their heads down, covered in long tunics and thick gloves, their faces obscured by scarves. They carry long poles, and every now and then they stop to prod a body lying motionless in the street. If the body twitches, they move on. If it doesn't, they lift it onto the cart. No ceremony, no prayers. Just one more body, one more number. This is what happens when there are too many dead and not enough people left to bury them. Here's a mainstream historical fact to chill your pillow. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris, death rates soared so high that mass graves became the norm. Whole families would be buried together. Some were left unburied for days. Chroniclers write of dogs wandering the streets with human limbs in their mouths. But let's soften that a bit for tonight, shall we? Instead, let's focus on the logistic. Because plague, it turns out, is as much about management as it is about medicine. Cities had to invent new systems for removing the dead, clearing homes, even redistributing property. In some towns, laws were passed saying anyone could claim the house of a deceased person if they were brave enough to enter it. Spoiler, very few were. The baker's shop, boarded up now, a cloth has been nailed to the door. Someone has scrawled a warning on it in charcoal, morti dentro, dead inside. It's one of dozens the graveyards have filled. You walk to one just outside the city gate, and the air changes as you approach. It's sour, pungent, and earthy. Grave diggers work in silence, backs bent, hands blistered. They don't speak unless absolutely necessary. You hear one mutter, "Only 20 more today." In the orchard just past the old wall, you see rows of trenches, each deeper than the last. Men with wooden planks carefully slide wrapped bodies into them. They don't open the cloth, they don't check names. Sometimes they don't even close the eyes. A little girl watches from behind a tree, holding a doll. It's missing an arm. She doesn't cry. And yet, through all of this, the rats thrive. You see them darting between gravestones, slipping through the tall grass. One of them perches on a broken wall, nibbling a piece of dried fruit. You stare at it for a long time. It stares back. It's not afraid of you. Why should it be? Now for your quirky tidbit of the section. In certain cities like Avignon, people were dying so fast that the Pope had to consecrate the entire Rhone River to act as a floating burial ground. Yes, people were tossed in by the hundreds. Historians still argue whether this was a logistical decision or a spiritual one. Probably both. But either way, you don't want to go swimming there. You make your way back into the city, and the silence is louder now. No hawkers, no lute players. Even the stray dogs are subdued. You pass a small window where a woman is burning herbs in a ceramic bowl. The smoke wafts into the street, thin and blue. She believes it will cleanse the air. Her husband lies behind her, motionless on a straw mattress. She doesn't look back at him. Some people are still clinging to routine. A notary walks door to door, asking who's left to make a will. He carries an inkpot and a quill, but no parchment. He ran out 2 days ago and now writes on the backs of bread wrappers and discarded laundry lists. You hear him ask, "And who shall inherit the cow?" Nobody answers. This is how the cities begin to unravel, not with fire, not with riot, but with quiet. Systems collapse not in screams, but in whispers. Still people hope. They hang charms from their doors. They draw stars on their walls. One man walks through the streets with a sack of onions tied around his waist, claiming he hasn't coughed once. You don't correct him. It's the only thing keeping him upright. And then there's the rumor, a fresh one, passing like wind between alleyways. The rats are to blame. Someone saw a scholar dissect a rat. Claimed its guts were crawling with worms. Said it smelled wrong. Others laugh. It's a rat, they say. Of course it smells wrong. But the idea has been planted. Something to blame. Something small, fast, and everywhere. You duck into a chapel to rest. It's dim, lit only by flickering candles. The priest is gone. A cat prowls the altar, knocking over a chalice with its tail. A woman sits in the front row, rocking slowly. She hums a lullaby, something old, something about stars and sleep and summer wheat. You listen, and for a moment, the plague is far away. Then the bell tolls again. The next morning comes without a rooster's crow. You rise slowly, stepping out from the chapel's cool stone into sunlight that feels too bright for such a hushed world. The streets aren't empty, but they feel hollow. People move, yes, but as if underwater, slow, cautious, their eyes darting sideways more than forward. And now, everywhere, talk has turned to suspects. You overhear it in hushed voices at the well, in whispers outside shuttered windows, in fragments caught between coughs. And at the center of every whispered theory is a trio of strange villains, fleas, rats, and bad air. Today you follow the noise to a corner of the city where the apothecary still opens his door, barely. His sign is faded, a painted mortar, and pestles swinging creakily in the breeze. Inside it smells like dried thyme and crushed beetles. The apothecary, an old man named Aldo, leans on a stick and grumbles about how things used to be quieter, how nobody appreciated his pine resin. Poultices until they started dying. He shows you something small, a tiny flea trapped in a little glass vial, wriggling furiously. He squints through a magnifying lens. "They say it's these little bastards," he mumbles. "Not the rats, but the fleas. Ride the rats like knights. Jump to people, suck them dry, they carry death in their bellies." And this is where things get interesting, because here's your mainstream historical fact. The prevailing theory for centuries has been that the Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas that often lived on black rats. Rattus rattus. The fleas would bite an infected rat, pick up the bacterium, and then bite humans, transmitting the plague. But that tidy little transmission model, it doesn't quite add up. And Aldo, your sleepy apothecary, isn't convinced either. "I haven't seen a dead rat in days," he says, scratching at his beard. "But I've seen plenty of dying men. That's the first crack in the theory." You leave the apothecary and head to the city granary. It's quiet. Too quiet for a place that normally bustles with carts, shouting merchants, and sacks of barley being hauled like sleepy toddlers. Inside, a few workers, those who are still well enough, are trying to salvage the grain. And they're not alone. Rats dart between the bags, their tails like pale ropes in the shadows. They nibble, climb, even squabble with each other. But again, they all look healthy. You crouch and watch for a while. One rat nibbles at a loose oat and then, hearing a footstep, vanishes behind a barrel. Not a single one looks sick. No piles of rat corpses, no sluggish rodents staggering in corners. Curious, isn't it? Because if the plague spreads by rats dying, fleas jumping and then infecting humans, shouldn't the rats be dying first? Shouldn't there be some massive, furry die-off before the people fall? Quirky tidbit time. In many accounts from 1347 to 1351, there is almost no mention of dead rats in the streets, despite detailed, even morbid descriptions of human suffering. Historians still argue whether that's because chroniclers simply didn't bother noting rats, as they were so common, or whether rats simply weren't dying in droves at all, and now people are starting to ask the same thing. "Have you seen any sick rats?" a woman mutters as she wraps cloth around her daughter's hands. "No," replies a neighbor, "but I've seen a boy drop dead right in the bakery." So what gives? You visit a physician's quarters. Well, what's left of them? The physician himself is gone, off on some desperate errand to treat 5 noblemen with the same jar of goose fat and vinegar, but his notes remain. You flip through parchment after parchment. The Latin is spidery, hard to read, but there's one phrase that repeats, inter homines non inter mures, among men, not among mice. He too is beginning to suspect. Now imagine you're a citizen of this city. You don't know about bacteria. You don't know about plague strains or vector hosts. You just know that people are dying fast and the rats are still eating your leftover porridge like nothing's wrong. So a new idea begins to spread. Maybe the rats aren't the cause. Maybe they're just convenient background noise. And maybe the real danger is smaller or stranger or something you've never noticed. You pass by the tannery and the stench nearly bowls you over. Animal skins piled high. Workers rubbing salt into leather. But even here, where vermin are rampant and cleanliness is a theoretical concept, there are no dead rats. The tannery foreman tells you flatly, the rats are having a better year than we are. The bell tolls again. You've lost count now. Was that 12 times today? 14? You pause at a bridge and watch the river drift below. A shoe bobs along the surface. Then a hat. Then just barely, you see a wrapped bundle float silently past. You don't look too closely. The city is unraveling, but the rats? Business as usual. And this contradiction will haunt scholars, doctors, and poets for generations to come. You lean against the low stone wall by the bridge, watching the current carry away another forgotten object. This time, what looks like a wooden toy missing a wheel. The river doesn't stop. It doesn't care, and neither apparently do the rats. You begin to notice something strange. The plague is racing ahead, sweeping through neighborhoods like wildfire in a thatched roof village. Entire districts fall silent within days. But the rats, still skittering, still eating, still squeaking from the rafters, it's as if the plague doesn't need them at all. And now, so do the scholars of your time begin to question everything. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 20th century, many researchers realized something didn't quite line up. The Black Death spread much faster than any rat-flea-human transmission model would allow. In some areas, towns hundreds of kilometers apart fell ill within days of each other, long before rats, or fleas, could have reasonably made the journey. And so begins what historians now call the Great Rat Debate. Some stand firm. Rats must have been part of the equation. After all, they're classic culprits, conveniently gross and always underfoot. Others begin whispering new possibilities. Could it have been person to person? Could the real villain have been the mnemonic form of plague, airborne, and far more contagious? You duck into a crumbling university hall where the handful of remaining students are arguing over wine and bad breath. One slams a dusty manuscript down, declaring, "No rat can outrun a horse!" Another insists that the fleas are hiding in fabrics, not fur. A third mutters, "What if it wasn't rats or fleas, but people all along?" You step back outside. The city is buzzing with confusion, but the rats? Still smug. Now let's sprinkle. In tonight's fringe tidbit, there's a theory, still debated, still on the edge of respectable academia, that human body lice, not fleas, may have been the primary transmission vector during the plague years. These lice could spread directly from person to person, skipping the middleman entirely. Historians still argue whether the lice theory fits better with the explosive speed of infection seen during the Black Death. The idea spreads. If the disease isn't waiting around for rats to die and fleas can live on people, then maybe the true danger is inside your own clothes. You pause at a laundress's hut, where bed sheets hang like white flags of surrender. She boils water with herbs, lavender, sage, marjoram, muttering prayers as she dunks tunics into the pot. "It's not the rats," she says without looking at you. "It's what clings to us, in our seams, in our sleeves. It's not a comforting thought. The priest you saw earlier, he's begun wearing gloves and a veil, not because it works, but because it feels like something. You notice him pausing before entering each home now. Sometimes he knocks. Sometimes he doesn't. And then you hear it again. From a different direction. That same whisper. The plague moves too fast for the rats. You head toward the town gates, past deserted shops and abandoned wagons. A dying horse lies in the road, its ribs like piano keys beneath its skin. Someone's covered its eyes with a linen scrap. At least they tried. Outside the gates, travelers huddle, merchants, messengers, a farmer with a crate of ducks. None are allowed in. The guard, pale and sweating, waves them away. Come back in a week, he says. Or don't. The ducks quack quietly. Even they seem subdued. You stop at a map, nailed to a public board, covered in scribbles and annotations. Someone's been tracking the spread of the plague across Europe. Arrows drawn in ink, towns labelled with skulls. You follow the line from Messina up through Florence, across to Avignon and into Paris. The lines move faster than any caravan, faster than any boat should be able to travel. Too fast. That's the phrase that keeps circling in your mind. Too fast for rats. It's like the disease has its own wind. It rides fear. It spreads in stories as much as symptoms. You hear a traveller say his cousin died just from hearing of the plague. Another claims it floated in through keyholes. They're wrong, of course, but also they're not entirely wrong, because something is moving invisibly, unstoppably. You turn back to the city. The sun is starting to dip, the light softening to honey gold across the rooftops. Smoke curls from just a few chimneys now. The air smells of thyme and ash. On the steps of the tavern, you find 3 children playing with pebbles. They're quiet, focused, not laughing. One of them pauses and says, "Mama said if you catch a rat, you get a coin, but I don't want to touch one." You don't blame her. Even in all this confusion, fear, and loss, nobody seems eager to touch the rats. Blame them? Maybe. But handle them? That's a different story. You keep walking, the stones warm under your feet, the wind picking up. You wonder if the rats really were innocent. Why did it take so long to suspect something else? And perhaps, just perhaps, humans were too busy burying their neighbours to question what scurried beneath the floorboards. You wake to scratching sounds in the wall beside your straw bed. It's early. The sun hasn't quite warmed the rooftops yet. The streets outside are quiet, not the hush of sleep, but the kind of silence cities only wear after something has been taken from them. Permanently. You press your ear to the cold stone and hear it again, the high-pitched rustle of tiny claws on wood. The rats are still at it, same as yesterday, same as always. You sit up slowly, brushing straw from your sleeve. Your tunic smells of old garlic and smoke. The corner of the room holds a loaf of bread, half mouldy, half guarded by a rat, who eyes you like he dares you to try him. You stare back. He doesn't flinch. And this morning, you're wondering, what kind of rat is he? Here's your mainstream's historical fact. The typical culprit in plague theories has long been the black rat, or Rattus rattus, small, sleek, with a long tail and a fondness for climbing into roofs and rafters. But here's the rub. Rattus rattus is notoriously bad at surviving cold climates, and yet the plague ravaged northern regions during freezing seasons. And that's where things start to itch, like a flea bite behind the ear. You wrap a scarf around your neck and head toward the granary again. The place is alive with scratching, rustling, and the faint chittering that says, "We were here before you. We'll be here after." You glance into a burlap sack of oats and see not one but 5 rats inside, cozy as monks in a chapel. They look sleek, groomed, shiny-eyed, and incredibly not dead, so you start asking around. You speak with a merchant who once travelled to Lübeck, up in chilly northern Germany. He tells you that during the worst days of the plague, they barely saw any black rats at all, only brown rats, larger, more aggressive, and newer to the scene. He shrugs. Maybe they brought it, he offers, then corrects himself. Or maybe they just cleaned up after. You move to the docks and watch a rat scurry down a rope from a ship's hull. He lands nimbly, sniffs the air, and disappears behind a barrel of spoiled wine. Now here comes the quirky detail of the day. The brown rat, Ratus norvegicus, the species we're most familiar with today, likely didn't even arrive in Western Europe until the 18th century, hundreds of years after the Black Death. Meaning, the ones you're seeing now? Almost certainly black rats, but ones behaving too confidently, too healthily for their supposed role in this apocalypse. Historians still argue whether the black rat was truly the main vector, or if the role of another flea species, Pulex irritans, the human flea, has been vastly underestimated. Unlike the Xenosilla chiopes, the rat flea, Pulex irritans jumps between people, not rats. It lives in clothing, blankets, and those adorable linen coifs everybody's been sweating through for weeks. In a dark stone basement near the cathedral, you meet a scholar who keeps dead fleas in tiny glass jars. He's lost 3 assistants this month, but insists his work must continue. He unrolls a parchment that reads like a plague family tree. Rats to fleas, fleas to humans, humans to... Humans? It moves too quickly, he mutters, as if repeating a private mantra. Too fast for rats, too slow for logic. He points to a diagram that suggests a plague might jump without a rodent at all. Airborne, maybe, or from skin to skin. You watch as he boils water to wash his hands. It's the cleanest thing you've seen in days. You step back into the light, your feet crunching on frost. It's cold now. Your breath fogs the air. And yet, the plague rages on. That's the part no one expected. Everyone thought it would die with the summer heat, but it didn't. And now, in the chill, the rats are less active, but people keep dying. Even less reason to suspect the rats. You visit a butcher who has started leaving his doors open, not for fresh air, but because he's stopped caring. He says, "If it's rats, may they take the last sausages and leave me be." He laughs, but it's brittle. His son died yesterday. You crouch behind the bakery, where a cluster of rats is gnawing on old rye. One of them sniffs, squeaks, and jumps right over your boot. You flinch, and for a second you feel silly. They're just rats, right? But then you remember what the scholar said. We blamed them because they were there, not because we proved anything. And suddenly, you're not so sure. One final image lingers with you as the sun dips lower. A boy walking alone, barefoot through the frost, holding a dead rat by the tail. He looks proud, like he's found something forbidden. Behind him, his mother calls for him to come inside. He doesn't answer. It's evening again. Smoke curls upward from a few surviving hearths. The air smells faintly of rosemary and burnt bread, and the city seems quieter still, like a great exhale that never quite becomes an inhale again. You sit on the edge of a crumbling wall, legs dangling, and watch 2 rats fight over a withered turnip. One wins, the other squeaks indignantly, vanishes under the rubble, and importantly does not drop dead of plague on the spot. And this is where it gets really strange, because by now You've wandered through the filthiest alleys and the cleanest monasteries. You've seen the insides of grain silos, bakeries, wine cellars, even a dentist's shed full of tooth extraction pliers and one very haunted-looking chicken. The rats are everywhere, and they're doing just fine, and yet the people dropping like flies. Let's get tonight's mainstream historical fact out of the way. The Black Death spread with terrifying speed, often faster than trade routes, fleas or rats could reasonably travel. In some cases, towns 100 miles apart were infected just days apart, too fast for a traditional flea and rat relay. And that's where tonight's suspicious little question arises. What if the rats were never infected at all? See, in modern outbreaks of bubonic plague, yes, it's still around, massive die-offs of rat populations usually precede human infection. Entire colonies of rats die suddenly, and the fleas jump hosts, turning to humans. That's the playbook, but during the Black Death, no chroniclers mention heaps of dead rats. No one says the rats died first and then we followed. Not in France, not in Italy, not even in plague-obsessed England, where they once chronicled the daily behaviour of dancing bears. Historians still argue whether this absence of dead rats in records is a gap in observation, or proof the rats weren't involved in the first place. Were they so common nobody bothered mentioning them? Or did they simply survive the storm? You visit a cloth merchant's abandoned home. Spools of dyed wool sit untouched. The colours, deep indigo, rich ochre, faded green, are still vivid despite the dust. On a bench, a rat is curled into a neat loaf, snoozing in the folds of a crimson cloak. He opens one eye when you step close. No fear. No signs of illness, just rat serenity. Nearby, a journal sits half-written. Day 3. Maria feverish, swelling. The priest did not come. Still, the rats scratch behind the oven. They do not die. It's hard to argue with first-hand experience. You step outside into a narrow lane lined with shuttered windows. The smell of vinegar wafts from an open pail. Someone's still trying to disinfect, bless them. A cat watches you from a rooftop, its eyes gleaming gold. It hisses softly, maybe at you, maybe at the rat beneath your feet. Here comes the fringe tidbit. In 2018, a team of researchers used mathematical models to simulate plague outbreaks based on 3 transmission types: rat, flea, human, airborne, and human ectoparasites, lice, fleas. Their models suggested human-to-human parasite transmission fit the actual Black Death spread pattern far better than the rat-based version. Of course, historians still argue whether that model holds for all regions, but the rat's role? Shrinking by the century. You pass a pile of straw in a butcher's alley and spot something small and dark. No, not a body, just a heap of onions and a pair of broken clogs. Next to it, a perfectly healthy rat licking grease off the cobbles. He scurries away when a bell tolls. Even he's tired of hearing it. You duck into a tavern, empty now, but the scent of beer and sweat still clings to the beams. Scratched into one of the long tables are 3 letters. PFR. You trace your fingers over them. Plague-free rat? Probably not. But it's nice to think someone was starting to wonder. In a dry field near the city walls, you find a boy watching the horizon. He's maybe 12. In his lap, a cage. Inside, 3 rats. I feed them barley, he says without turning. They've been fine. You ask if anyone else has gotten sick. He nods. Everyone, he gestures toward the town, but not them. You sit with him for a moment, listening to the wind. The cage rattles softly as one rat yawns and stretches its tiny arms, arms far too small, frankly, to carry the weight of centuries of blame. You wonder how we all got so convinced. Was it the way they dart and hide, the tails, the bad PR, or maybe we just needed something to point at to make sense of the senseless? You get up, nod to the boy, and walk slowly back toward the city. The rats follow, but only because you dropped a breadcrumb. You find yourself retracing the plague's path, not with maps or manuscripts this time, but by following whispers, old rumors, and the odd note carved into doorways. The trail is unsettlingly fast. You start in the port cities, Messina, Genoa, Venice, where the plague first stepped ashore like an uninvited guest with terrible manners. Then inland, Siena, Florence, Marseille, and soon after it hits towns nowhere near the coast, places with no ships, no rats on board, and no time to prepare. That's when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It's spreading too fast for rats to be the couriers. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Black Death moved at an average rate of several miles per day, far faster than any known rat migration. In some cases, entire regions were infected within days of the first case appearing. That kind of speed suggests something more aerodynamic than a rodent. You walk into a village on a trade route, small, quiet, surrounded by flat fields and the sound of distant cowbells. You'd expect a place like this to be the last to fall ill. But no, the priest is gone. The baker's family lies bundled beneath a blanket in the barn. The well has a rope sign reading, "Do not drink." A woman sits on a stool by her gate. She fans herself, though the day is cool. "It came on the wind," she says softly, like a song you can't stop hearing. And maybe she's right. You stop at an abandoned way station and peer into a traveller's journal, scribbled between notes about hay prices and spoiled cheese. 3 days ago, the next village was fine. Yesterday, they burned the sick in a field. Today, the rats still skitter beneath my cart, but the black spots are on my hands. It's chilling, not because of the poetry, but because of the speed. You remember how slow rat colonies move, how limited their travel is, especially across mountains, frozen rivers, or borders watched by guards. Yet the disease pays no heed to terrain. It simply arrives. Quirky tidbit for tonight. Some cities in Eastern Europe closed their gates completely, enforcing brutal quarantines, and managed to delay the plague's arrival for years. Dubrovnik, for instance, established one of the first known quarantine zones in 1377. Historians still argue whether this delay was because the plague really moved by rats, or if it simply relied on infected humans, and blocking them slowed the spread. You sit beneath an archway where travellers once waited to show their wares. Now it's just you, the dust, and one very determined rat trying to chew through a length of rope. You watch him for 10 minutes. He makes no progress. He's dying. Not in a hurry, unlike the disease, and that's the thing. Rats aren't efficient delivery boys. They stop, they eat, they nest. They're not crossing 20 miles in a day to make sure the next village gets their quota of plague. But humans? Oh, we move. You meet a courier at the edge of town, crouched beside his horse. He's pale, sniffling, arms blotched, with early signs. "I rode all night," he mumbles. "Didn't want to die in Florence." You ask if he saw any rats along the road. He laughs. "No, but I saw smoke behind me. Lots of smoke. People are burning their belongings now. Clothes, straw beds, food carts, hoping the fire will chase away what they don't understand." And all the while, the rats continue living as rats do, grubby, clever, and entirely too calm for disease bearers. You walk to the next village. A woman with 2 children stands at a bridge, weeping into her apron. "We sent no letters," she says. "No cards. No one left, no one arrived. But we're still sick." You want to say something comforting. You don't. Instead, you look down at the bridge. It's made of old stone, worn smooth from feet, not paws. Back in the fields, farmers wear bundles of herbs around their necks. Some swear by mint, others by marigold. One man's wearing a necklace of garlic bulbs so large it looks like he's auditioning for a cook's mural. When asked if rats brought the sickness, they shake their heads. "It was the merchant's boy," says one. "He only stayed a night, that. Boy left 4 days ago. The village has 6 new graves. Still think the rats carried it?" Here's your academic seasoning. Epidemiologists in recent decades have proposed that the pneumonic form of plague, airborne, person to person, could explain the impossible speed of spread in certain regions. Historians still argue whether it was a combination of bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic forms that together created the storm. You lie down beneath a fig tree as dusk falls. Somewhere nearby, you hear a cough. Not a loud one, but the kind that makes you flinch now. A rat rustles in the leaves near your head. He stops, sniffs, and resumes his journey. He is unbothered. He does not bring death, he brings dinner scraps, and maybe, just maybe, it's time to give the little guy a break. You awake to frost. It coats the rooftops in a silvery hush, whispers from the stones beneath your feet, and clings to the shutters like lacework spun by a spider with very cold hands. Winter has arrived, and with it, a whole new mystery. Because, here's the thing, the plague should have slowed down. Black rats, you may recall, are famously not fans of the cold. They love warmth, cozy grain stores, thatched roofs. They don't frolic in the snow or go on icy jogs through medieval alleyways. In theory, the colder it gets, the fewer rats you see, and yet the plague doesn't stop, not even a little. In fact, in some places, it accelerates. Let's open with tonight's mainstream historical fact. According to records from the mid-14th century, the Black Death didn't wane during cold months. In some regions, it surged. Cities like Strasbourg and Vienna were devastated during bitter winters. That doesn't match the behavior of a disease supposedly reliant on rats and fleas, both of whom do not handle snow well. You crunch across a frozen courtyard. Someone's carved a small cross in the ice on a barrel lid. You pause to touch it, then pull your hand back. It's too cold to hold meaning. The streets are quieter now. Cold tends to mute things. There's a layer of stillness over everything, like the city's trying not to breathe. But inside the homes, the plague is very much alive. You enter a cottage with frost creeping across the window panes. Inside, 3 generations huddle by the hearth. Grandmother is pale. She's coughing. Her hand trembles slightly in her lap. She hasn't left the house in days. No new visitors, no rats inside. And still, the signs are all there. A small boy in the corner hugs a pillow embroidered with a rooster. The sickness came even though the snow did, he says, simply. He doesn't sound afraid, just tired. Here comes tonight's quirky detail. One chronicler in Germany described death travelling by breath in the snow, noting how entire families became ill without ever leaving their homes. Historians still argue whether this poetic phrasing was just fear, or if it hinted at airborne transmission. You find yourself wandering into a barn where the livestock stand eerily still. The farmer tells you, yeah, the rats left a week ago, haven't seen one since. But his cousin just died yesterday. So much for the rat exodus being a sign of safety. And as you warm your hands by a brazier filled with burning peat, another truth settles in. The colder it gets, the less likely it is that flea activity is to blame. Fleas don't like the cold. They grow sluggish, they die off. Even wrapped in fur or blankets, their survival rates plummet. You visit a monastery where the remaining monks wear layers of wool and silence. One leads you to a chamber of scribes, or rather, what's left of them. One monk remains hunched over a book. He writes slowly, deliberately. His ink freezes in the well between strokes. On the margin of his page, he's written a tiny note. The rats are gone. But the cough remains. You nod, even though he doesn't look up. In your journey today, you pass through 3 villages, all half buried in snow, all mid-plague. At one stop, a merchant stares into his stew pot. He says, "I haven't seen a flea in a fortnight, but I buried my wife this morning." He looks at you blankly. "I boiled her blankets, the rats didn't touch them." You pat his shoulder and move on. This section's scholarly seasoning. Some modern researchers suggest that pneumonic plague, spread through droplets, not fleas, was far more common during winter waves of the pandemic. It explains the spread without fleas, without rats, even without much human contact. Just breath, cough, and closed windows. Historians still argue whether this airborne form was the dominant strain or just a terrifying side dish. You reach the edge of a frozen lake by dusk. Ducks skate awkwardly on the glassy surface. And near the reeds, a familiar sound, a soft rustle, a scratch. You wait. Sure enough, a rat pokes its nose out of a hollow log. His whiskers twitch. He eyes the cold with distaste. He does not venture far, even he knows better. And that's the point. The plague is moving. But the rats? Staying put. If this were their doing, shouldn't they be spreading it faster, in warm
months and slowing in winter? But here we are. Ice on the rooftops, frost on the doors, and the sickness burning behind the eyes of everyone you meet. You wrap your cloak tighter, stare into the icy distance, and whisper, not for the first time, if not the rats, then what?
The frost is still clinging to your boots as you walk, leaving wet footprints on packed earth. You head inland, far from the busy ports and river cities, into the kind of countryside where even the rats might reconsider living. This is a place of quiet farms, low stone walls, and smoke curling lazily from chimneys. The roads are muddy tracks. The homes are timber and thatch. There's no marketplace, no scholars, no imported silk, just cows, chickens, maybe a pig or two. And yet they're dying here too, which is odd. Because if this was about trade, or rat-infested cargo, or infected bolts of wool carried in bustling carts, then surely these places would be spared, or at least spared a little longer. But no. You stop at a farmhouse where a boy stands barefoot in the mud, holding a wooden toy, soldier in one hand and a rabbit in the other. "Father's in the barn," he says softly. He started coughing after the priest left. The priest who had ridden in from 2 villages away. You nod and walk the perimeter of the house. There's no sign of rats. No grain sacks with bite holes. No sounds in the walls. Even the chickens seem lonely. Here's tonight's historical fact. The Black Death didn't only devastate cities, it wiped out rural villages sometimes before they had any confirmed contact with plague-ridden towns. Entire hamlets vanished, with no signs of trade contact, no major roads, and no observable rat populations. The boy's rabbit sneezes in your arms. You set it down. So if not rats, then what? Maybe humans, maybe air. Maybe, as one chronicler claimed, a darkness that moved with the breath of strangers. You head north to a hillside village that isn't even on most maps, a place with no inns, no tax collectors, no foreign goods. But it's been hit just the same. 3 cottages in, you hear it, the dry, hollow cough of someone trying not to die loudly. You find her sitting on a stool, an old woman, sharp-eyed, despite the dark stains spreading across her neck.
I haven't seen a rat in years, she rasps. Don't even keep grain anymore. I dry nettles. She points to the shelf. Jars of herbs line the wall. Dust gathers thick on each one. No gnaw marks, no rat droppings. I think it came with the wind, she whispers. Or with the men who rode past last week.
And now for your fringe detail. There are records from Scandinavia and inland France describing plague arriving in isolated towns with no trade connection at all, just a passing traveller. One case in Norway even mentions a shepherd who saw no one, but still got the fever. Historians still argue whether this suggests pneumonic transmission, latent carriers, or something even stranger, like infected goods that didn't require fleas at all. You walk up a small ridge and look down.
At the valley.
It's dotted with houses. A handful of plumes rise, cooking fires or funeral pyres. It's hard to say, and yet again, the rats are conspicuously absent. You find a crumbling manor house, once the seat of some minor nobleman who likely fled long ago. It's empty now. Vines creep across the stone like green fingers. You push open the great wooden door and step into a room filled with rotting banners and cold silence. In the corner, a cat. Thin, alert, surrounded by rat bones. So there were rats here once, but they've already moved on or been eaten, and still the manor's caretaker coughs in the upper chamber. Alone. You pause by a desk covered in letters. One reads, "No ship came, no visitor knocked, and yet we are ill." It's eerie. You step back into the yard where a young man is chopping wood, not for heat, but to build another coffin. He nods once at you and keeps working. "You're late," he says. "The plague came days ago. You ask about the rats." He chuckles. "Haven't seen one in a month." "I thought that was good luck." You glance toward the woods. They're still. Not silent, just still. No movement beneath the brush. No shadows darting. Not even the rustle of tiny feet. Which leaves you with a very strange thought. What if the plague doesn't follow the roads? What if it doesn't ride the rat? What if it just shows up? Maybe it's the merchant, the pilgrim, the priest, the soldier who kissed his wife goodbye and then walked 20 miles before falling over in someone else's barn. Maybe it is
Rats sometimes, but not always. And not here. The boy with the toy soldier passes by again. "You seen my rabbit?" he asks. You point toward the fence. The rabbit is still.
Too still. You don't say anything. You just watch the breeze roll through the valley, stirring leaves, whispering secrets the wind has no right to know. And you wonder again, if this isn't the rats' fault, then why have they been blamed for so long? Maybe because they're small, maybe because they can't talk back, or maybe because the real answer is much harder to accept. You've walked for miles, past the valleys, over frostbitten hills, through woods quiet enough to make you nervous. You haven't seen a living person in over an hour, just smoke trails on the horizon and a few goats chewing thoughtfully on fence posts, and yet the sickness is ahead of you, always ahead. You reach a crossroads marked only by a crooked wooden sign and a stone marker with a faint cross carved into it. Just ahead, the road curves into another village. No carts here. No
Market.
But the bell tolls anyway, just once. You follow the sound. Inside a cottage near the square, you find a woman with flushed cheeks sitting up in bed. Her lips are cracked. Her voice is low. She's speaking to no one. He coughed in the bread.
Lime, she mumbles. Just once, and then we all got it. You check the corners of the room. No rats, no food on the floor, no bundles of wool for fleas to hide in. Just the woman, her words, and a window that looks out onto an empty street. And
this is where your mind starts turning toward a different suspect. What if it wasn't just fleas? What if people spread the plague themselves? You may recall tonight's mainstream historical fact. The pneumonic form of the plague, a variation of Yersinia pestis that attacks the lungs, can be spread from person to person via droplets, with no flea required. And during the worst months of the Black Death, descriptions of victims coughing violently, bleeding from the lungs and infecting entire households suggest that pneumonic transmission may have been far more common than historians once thought, which would explain the impossible.
speed.
The rural outbreaks, the plague that arrived not with trade, but with people. You walk past a chapel where someone has scrawled, "Don't breathe near the altar." Seems a bit dramatic, but they're not wrong. You pass a row of houses where entire families lie still, untouched by rats, untouched by fleas. Just breath, just time. A strange thing happens when the enemy becomes invisible. People start to panic. You duck into a tavern that's been repurposed as a quarantine zone. No ale, no laughter, just straw mats and herbs smouldering in cracked
Bowls. A friar walks the rows, muttering prayers. He wears a cloth mask soaked in vinegar. A man lifts his head weakly and says, "Don't come close." You nod because now you are the suspect. That's the twist, isn't it? In a time before germ theory, people assumed illness had to come from somewhere else. A rat, a flea, a foreigner.
anything but themselves. But once the pattern becomes clear that whole households fall ill at the same time, that people can die just by being near the sick, well, the fear sharpens. Quirky detail tonight. During the height of the Black Death, some towns banned talking in public, believing that breath itself carried the plague. In Milan, entire houses were bricked shut with the sick still inside, based on the belief that even a cough through a window could kill. Historians still argue whether these actions saved lives or simply mirrored the desperate need for control. You return to the streets. You hold your breath passing doorways, you tie your scarf tighter. You're not even thinking about rats anymore. It's the people who worry you, and sure enough, that fear is everywhere now. You see it in the baker who won't accept coins unless they've been boiled. In the mother who refuses to let her children speak indoors. In the man who wears a dried orange peel around his neck and insists it's anti-airborne. You walk past a shrine where someone has left bread, a flower, and a note, "Forgive us for breathing." You think back to earlier days when the blame was clearer, on things that skittered, scratched, and stole food. Now the danger looks like you. It walks, it talks, it coughs. You sit on a stone wall and watch a funeral from a distance. 3 figures in long robes lower a wrapped body into a shallow grave. One coughs. They all flinch. No rats in sight, just humans carrying their burden in silence. And here's your scholarly seasoning for the night. Many modern researchers believe that the airborne transmission of plague via droplets played a larger role than once thought, particularly in colder, closed-in settings like households, monasteries, and rural cottages. The presence of multiple forms of plague simultaneously, bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, created a storm of confusion, allowing one form to mask the spread of another. Historians still argue how much of the mortality can be traced to airborne infections versus flea bites. You rest your head against the stone and close your eyes for a moment. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks. A door slams. The wind carries a single cough across the fields, and just like that you feel the smallest pinch of fear. Because the scariest enemy isn't the one you can see chewing on your bread. It's the one that's already inside your lungs. By now you recognize the sound. That dry, rattling inhale, the pause, then the wet, involuntary cough that echoes down stone corridors and wooden hallways like a warning bell. You're in the heart of the city again, if you can still call it that. The streets are patchworks of silence and ash. Laundry lines sag untouched. The scent of bread no longer drifts from the baker's oven, only smoke and something faintly metallic. You follow the sound of coughing. It leads you to a small square where a once busy well sits capped and abandoned. A boy sits beside it, wrapped in 3 cloaks despite the warmth. His eyes are glassy, but he's still upright, barely. He doesn't notice the rats. You do. 3 of them dart across the cobblestones behind him. They don't pause. They don't bite. They vanish under a cart that hasn't moved in days. It's not them. You're sure of it now, because you've spent weeks walking plague-ravaged roads, and you've seen more coughing mouths than dying rodents. And tonight, we're going deeper, into the lungs. Here's your mainstream historical fact. While bubonic plague, marked by painful swellings in the lymph nodes, was once considered the main killer, modern scholars believe pneumonic plague, which infects the lungs, may have played a much larger role in the Black Death. Pneumonic plague spreads via droplets in the air from coughs, sneezes, even breath. And unlike bubonic, it doesn't need fleas or rats, or even physical contact. You pass a tavern boarded up hastily, the sign hanging crooked on a single nail. Chalk on the door reads, "Do not enter, death by air." That phrase sticks with you. Not death by bite, or scratch, or vermin. Death by air. You find a woman in a tiny back alley, crouched beside a brazier filled with herbs. She waves a fan over it, muttering Latin prayers between breaths. "My husband coughed once," she says, not looking up. "And now I boil thyme all day." The smell is sweet, earthy, oddly calming. You sit beside her. "There were no rats in our house," she continues, as if needing to say it aloud. "We hung our grain, we sealed the doors, but he coughed once." She lets the fan fall to her lap. He didn't even have swellings, just fever. Then blood, then gone. And there it is, the thing that has haunted healers and scholars since the 14th century. Some people died of plague without buboes, without bites, without signs of infection other than the awful sound of their lungs failing them. You step inside a nearby church, cracked and crumbling. The altar is covered in herbs now. No chalice, no bread. Just bundles of sage and rosemary, meant to cleanse the air. The priest, what's left of him, lies behind a curtain, wrapped tightly in cloth. Someone left a note beside him. Died quickly. No swelling. Quirky tidbit of the night. Several plague treatises from the period refer to victims bleeding from the mouth and spitting blackness. These are classic signs of pneumonic plague, which has a near 100% fatality rate if untreated. Historians still argue whether early doctors even realized they were witnessing a different form of plague than the flea-borne variety. You lean against the church door and take a slow breath. The air tastes like dust and time. You recall the doctor you saw last week, wrapped in layers, beak-shaped mask stuffed with flowers. Not because it worked, but because it made him feel protected, and protection, even imaginary, is a kind of sleep aid. Outside the chapel, a group of men walk by in silence, carrying a long plank with 3 cloth-wrapped bodies. They don't speak, they don't make eye contact, they don't stop to question the rats. They've moved on. The enemy is in the breath now. You walk past a home with an open window. A child coughs inside. The curtains flutter faintly. You give the window a wide berth. It's not cruelty. It's instinct. Here comes the scholarly seasoning. In dense, cold cities with poor ventilation, pneumonic plague could have flourished, infecting multiple people in a single room in hours. Recent genetic studies suggest multiple strains of Yersinia pestis circulated simultaneously during the Black Death, some far more contagious than others. Historians still argue how these strains interacted, but they all agree. The lungs tell.
A different story. You stop beside a bakery long since abandoned.
The loaves inside are covered in mold. A cat perches in the windowsill. A rat runs past its paws. The cat doesn't chase. The rat doesn't flee. Even predators and prey have grown weary of this. You glance upward toward the rooftops. Smoke rises.
A bell rings. Somewhere, a man coughs, then falls silent. You tighten your scarf, not against fleas, not against rats, but against air.
You find yourself walking toward the edge of town, where the stone buildings thin into wooden cottages, and the air smells more like ash and herbs than human breath. There's a man standing on a hill, motionless, holding a bundle wrapped in linen. You can't see the face, but you already know what's inside. He doesn't cry. He just watches the horizon like he's waiting for the sun to change its mind. As you approach, he mutters, "They came too late. 3 days. No swelling. Just coughing. She was gone by sunrise." You nod slowly. "You seen the doctors?" he asks, not looking at you. "The ones with the beaks?" "Ah, yes. Them. Tonight you're finally meeting the plague doctor." Here's your mainstream historical fact. The infamous plague doctor costume, long black coat, gloves, hat, and that eerie bird-like mask, wasn't popularized until the 17th century, long after the Black Death's peak. But in popular memory, that image has become the face of the plague. The beak was often filled with herbs, thought to purify the air and ward off the invisible miasma believed to carry disease. You walk into a small makeshift infirmary, straw on the floor, buckets of sour wine, 2 patients, both wrapped to the chin. One groans, one stares blankly at the ceiling. A figure sits in the corner, adjusting gloves. The doctor's coat is waxed to resist moisture. His hands are covered. He wears a wide-brimmed hat, and yes, his mask juts forward in a sharp curve, like a raven that forgot how to fly. He turns toward you. The eyes behind the lenses blink slowly. "Are you sick?" he asks, voice muffled and dry. You shake your head. He points toward a bundle of dried flowers, lavender, rose petals, mint. "Breathe through those if you can," he says. "Don't speak too close to the dying." He doesn't mention rats. You sit nearby, watching him work. He checks, pulses, writes notes, mixes a dark, bitter syrup in a cracked bowl. The herbs don't help. The syrup is mostly for show. But what else can he do? Does it matter how they caught it? You ask. He looks at you for a long time, then shrugs. They die just the same. There's your grim truth of the evening. Still, people need reasons, need villains. So the rats remain in whispered stories and wall carving, blamed because it's easier than blaming the air. You step outside where a child is drawing in the dirt with a stick. Circles, spirals, and, oddly enough, a rat with a long tail and a little hat. You ask what it means. That's the rat.
That lives in our wall, she says. Mama says he brings sickness. I think he's funny. She smiles. The first one you've seen in hours. Quirky tidbit of the night. In several medieval woodcuts, plague was personified as devils, arrows,
From heaven, or even dancing skeletons. In some, rats are drawn wearing clothing, as if to satirize the absurdity of blaming animals for something people could not understand. Historians still argue whether these images were symbolic warnings or just morbid humor from a dying age. Eugene moved through the city gates, past a burned-down house where someone has carved "Plague No Entry" into the soot-stained door. You see a pair of feet inside, bare, unmoving. Above, a small weathercock turns in the breeze. It squeaks like a rat's laugh. Further down the road, you pass a row of crude statues, stone saints with cracked faces. Someone has tied herbs around their necks. One has a rat perched on its shoulder. The townsfolk have left it there. It looks content. You find another plague doctor walking alone. His robes flap in the breeze. He avoids everyone, crosses the street at the sound of a sneeze. The mask juts forward like an accusation. You ask him if the rats are to blame. He stops, thinks. I've seen people fall sick in homes without grain, he says. No rats, no fleas, just bad air or bad luck. Then he keeps walking, his footsteps soft on the dust. And here's tonight's scholarly seasoning. Though the image of the plague doctor is iconic, many were not physicians at all, but local tea. Volunteers, lawyers, or even con men hired to tend the sick and document the dead. Their equipment, masks, gloves, robes, was less about effectiveness and more about creating a barrier. A uniform that declared, I am here, but I am not involved. You look down at your own clothes. You've wrapped yourself in scarves, tied mint to your sleeves. You're starting to resemble them. You don't blame the rats, but you understand why. Someone needed to. Because blaming the air? Blaming breath? Blaming nothing? That's far too terrifying. Better to dress a man in a mask and pretend he holds the cure. Better to point at the shadows and say, there. That's what did it, even...
The shadows aren't moving anymore.
It's strange what you start to notice when your mind quiets down. The city's in decay, yes, but now your eyes catch details, the way dust gathers unevenly, the faded shoe prints leading nowhere, the rag doll left perfectly upright on a stoop, as if still waiting for its owner to return. You pass a baker's house. The flour sacks have long since been emptied, but in the corner, tucked behind a broken barrel, there's movement. Not a rat, a mouse. And now you begin to think, if rats were the obvious suspect, what about everything else that scurries and squeaks tonight? You're slipping into the walls, into the overlooked world of medieval rodents and their cozy little lives among the rafters and hay. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, black rats, Rattus rattus, lived closely with humans, often inside walls and thatched roofs. But so did house mice, Mus musculus, smaller, quieter, and even more likely to inhabit peasant homes. In fact, many rural households never encountered rats at all, only mice, voles, and other tiny cohabitants. Which raises a question. If plague came to homes without rats, what were the vectors? You step into a peasant cottage outside the city walls. A family of 4 once lived here. The fire's out, the beds are cold, and in the corner, nests, tiny ones, made from straw, bits of wool, even a torn hymn book page. You crouch down. Inside, one nest, a mouse is curled like a comma. Its fur is clean. It stirs, sniffs, and doesn't flee. You're not a threat, and it's not sick. You sit in the silence and think about how many creatures once shared this space. Chickens roosting on rafters, dogs at the door, pigs under the floorboards, all of them potential carriers or victims, and yet the only thing that seems to be dying in droves is the people, quirky tidbit of the night. In 14th century Europe, it was common for domestic rodents, mice, not rats, to live inside homes, undisturbed. Some were even fed intentionally as they were believed to bring good luck. In parts of Germany, it was said that if the house mice left suddenly, death was coming. Historians still argue whether that was superstition or an unintentional sign of environmental disruption. You walk out into the yard. A woman sits near a chicken coop, burning sage in a broken clay bowl. "The mice have all gone," she murmurs. "Even they don't want to stay." You glance at the coop, empty, except for feathers and a single egg. She adds, almost absently, "No one blames the mice." And she's right, because mice are small, harmless, they don't look like villains. But neither, you think, does the breeze. You head toward a barn. The hay is sweet and stale. Somewhere in the rafters, something shifts. Maybe a rat, maybe a bird, maybe your imagination. The barn cat is asleep near the door, tail twitching. You find a ledger tucked beneath a bale, an inventory from months ago. Flour, cheese, onions. No mention of illness, no mention of rats. But in the margin, someone's written "all dead now," except the mice. You stare up at the beams, remembering all the times you've heard scratching in the walls. Only now, it feels less like accusation and more like background noise. And here's your scholarly seasoning for the night. Some researchers suggest that focusing solely on rats may have caused centuries of misdirection, ignoring the broader ecology of plague. In rural homes especially, other small mammals and parasites living on humans themselves, fleas, lice, mites, could have carried the bacterium more efficiently. Historians still argue whether our fixation on rats was based more on visibility than virology. You walk a little farther down the road, stopping near a crumbled stone fence. There, a pile of rotted fruit draws a crowd. 2 rats, a vole, and a handful of mice nibbling side by side. You watch in silence. None of them collapse.
None of them even sneeze. You lean against the fence and close your eyes. This whole time, it's been about stories. Who we decide to blame. Who we think looks like the kind of creature that should carry death. But maybe, just maybe, the truth
Isn't who's guilty, it's who we noticed first, and who we ignored. The mouse scurries by your foot, still alive, still forgotten. You're on the road again, this time not by foot, but swaying gently atop a hay cart. The driver is old, quiet, and chewing something too tough to be food. You share no words. The cart creaks, the oxen snort clouds into the morning air. You're leaving Europe for a while. Because if the rats didn't start the fire, maybe the match was struck elsewhere. Tonight, you're following the trail backwards, along the trade routes that brought not just silk and spices, but whispers of death in burlap sacks and camel caravans. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Black Death likely originated in Central Asia, possibly near modern-day Kyrgyzstan, before moving westward along the Silk Roads via trade caravans, eventually reaching Crimea and spreading into Europe by ship. The plague travelled with merchants, soldiers, pilgrims and goods across deserts, mountains and ports, but tonight we're in the in-between spaces, dusty trails, ancient oases, the humming silence of endless plains. This isn't the rats' world anymore. It's the realm of camels, cold winds and caravan bells. You pass a caravanserai nestled in a sun-baked gorge. It smells of spice and sweat. Traders from Persia, the steppe, India. Some smile, some cough. You notice the camels. They kneel quietly, chewing with a mechanical indifference. You approach one, old, shaggy, with gentle eyes, and spot fleas hopping in its fur. Wait, fleas? Yes, and this is tonight's first unsettling twist. Fleas that transmit Yersinia pestis don't just live on rats. They can live on a wide range of mammals, including camels, goats, gerbils, and even humans. You begin to realize that the rat theory may be a case of Eurocentric thinking, a convenient explanation for what Western chroniclers could see, rather than a full account of what actually happened. You enter a tent where a trader tends, a wound with ash and vinegar. "The man from Kashgar died yesterday," he says.
Fever, bleeding, no injury. You ask if there were rats. No rats, he says, but many fleas and too many travellers. In the sand just outside the encampment, you see movement. Small paws, long tail, tan fur. Not a rat, a gerbil. Quirky.
Detail of the night. In 2015, scientists studying plague strains found DNA evidence in ancient Kyrgyz tombs suggesting that the Black Death emerged from a local reservoir of Yersinia pestis, possibly spread by gerbils or marmots, not rats. Historians still argue whether the plague reservoir theory explains recurring outbreaks or just one deadly ignition. You sit in a tent made of wool and camel hide, sharing a bowl of something hot and unidentifiable. A young woman burns herbs at the flap. She tells you, "The wind carries death, always has." You ask about rodents. She shrugs. Everything here bites. She's not wrong. You move on, riding with the next caravan eastward, then north. The stars blaze above like candle wax spilled on black velvet. In the chill, someone sneezes, no one says anything. The next town is a market hub. Carts of fabric, salt, fish, carved jade. The plague has not arrived yet. But already people speak of it, not in fear, in inevitability. A monk from Samarkand offers you a copy of a scroll. It's a map of sick towns. He has been adding dots for months.
It always moves west, he says. Always toward the sea. He hands you a vial.
Inside, a flea. "You'll want to keep that," he says, completely serious. "The real ones are smaller." You place it in your satchel, and here's your scholarly seasoning. New studies of plague genomes show that multiple strains of Yersinia pestis were circulating in Asia and the Middle East long before 1347. The disease may have burned through regions unrecorded by European historians, killing thousands in towns with no chroniclers, no parchment, no ink. Which means Europe was not the beginning. It was just the part that got remembered. As you leave the town, a storm rolls over the desert. Gritty wind, low thunder, the smell of sand and iron. You find a flat rock to sit on.
Wrapping yourself tightly. The rats are far away now. And still you feel the plague moving, not through cities, but along paths. Not through rats, but through hands, breath, dust. Stories. It's not about the creatures we see, it's about the invisible
web that connects them all. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we chose to blame the rats. Because it was easier than accepting that the world itself was already connected. long before anyone thought to look for fleas. You stay with the caravan until sunrise. When the traders rise to boil tea and brush sand from their cloaks, you slip away on foot, heading toward the edge of the great steppe where green meets gold, and the trade winds never stop moving. The road is long and oddly comforting. Gone are the cramped city streets and rotting bread carts. Here, the breeze is sharp, the sky vast, and the ground under your boots crunches with dry grass and shattered pottery. And yet the plague was here, too. You follow an old road, a path once walked by merchants, monks, smugglers, and soldiers. There's no sign of war, no smoke, no fallen banners. But the villages along the way are mostly empty, not burned, not sacked, just silent. You arrive at one of these ghost towns by midday. The gates swing open in the wind. The main street is still lined with colourful fabrics, now sun-bleached and fluttering. It doesn't smell of death, it just smells forgotten. You step inside what was once a rug shop. The shelves are stacked with bolts of fabric, Persian silks, Uzbek cotton, Mongolian wool. Dust lies thick over everything, and then you spot the fleas. Tiny dark dots leaping across a woven rug like panicked punctuation. No rats, just fleas and fibers. Tonight, you're in the world of invisible caravans and how they may have carried the seeds of death without even realizing it. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Along the Silk Roads, goods were transported over vast distances, often over months, with minimal contact between handlers and recipients. Carpets, furs, and tightly packed textiles were perfect habitats for fleas, capable of surviving for weeks in darkness, laying eggs and hitching quiet rides across continents. You crouch beside the rug, listening. No movement, no scratching. Just the faint rustle of cloth when the wind nudges the door. You find a ledger under the counter, transactions dated, names marked off. A red stain here. A thumbprint maybe, or maybe something else. No mention of rats. The goods themselves were the vessels. And so comes tonight's quirky tidbit. Some historians believe trade goods may have served as passive carriers of plague. Flea-infested fabrics moving faster than animals or people. Rolled carpets, bales of fur, even tightly packed wool could harbour both fleas and the bacterium, ready to infect handlers days or weeks after the goods left an infected city. Historians still argue whether this passive transmission explains the spread into isolated trading posts. You wander through the town's tea house, long since emptied. A cup lies overturned. The herbs are dry but still fragrant. The benches are dusted in fine sand. On the wall, a painted sign reads, "The wind does not ask permission." You believe it. You step into the bathhouse. Steam has long vanished. The water has dried, leaving faint mineral rings in the tubs. The place is spotless, except for a small sack in the corner. You open it. Cotton. And the unmistakable itch of movement beneath. You drop it. Fast. Still no rats. You exit back into the sunlight. It's strong now, the kind of light that casts long shadows and makes you squint into the future. A camel snorts behind you. Someone's arrived. A trader from the next outpost. He's wrapped tight in layers. He doesn't cough, but you can tell he's wary. You ask if he's seen the plague. He nods. "Not here," he says, "but I bought a rug in Samarkand and my servant died within a week." You look at the rug tied to his saddle. You say nothing. Instead, you help him carry water. And here's your scholarly seasoning. A 2020 study proposed that the plague bacillus could survive in dried material, such as grain or cloth, for limited periods under the right conditions. If true, this offers an explanation for outbreaks in seemingly untouched locations, especially those linked to caravans or port shipments. Historians still argue how often this inert freight transmission occurred, but it deepens the suspicion that rats weren't the only carriers. That night, you camp near a crumbled stone watchtower. The stars are brutal and endless. A cold wind brushes your tent flap. Somewhere nearby, a fox screams, then silence. You hold a woven scarf to your face, not because you think it helps, but because doing something always feels better than nothing. You wonder about the merchant in Venice who opened a rug from the east, or the tailor in Marseille who bought silk stitched by hands long dead. No rats in sight, just fibers, dust, fleas waiting to wake. You roll onto your back and look at the sky. How many deaths came in silence? How many in color? How many wrapped in silk? The next morning, you cross into highlands where trees grow lean and sparse, and the wind sings songs it learned from forgotten cities. The air feels thinner, sharper, the trail narrows, and as you walk, you think about something that's been bothering you since the beginning. The name? The Black Death. It sounds dramatic, final, almost theatrical, but is it accurate? Was it black? Was it death? Tonight, you start pulling that apart. Here's your mainstream historical fact, the term black. Death wasn't used during the actual 14th century pandemic. It came centuries later, likely translated from the Latin atra mors, which could mean either black death or terrible death. At the time, most Europeans simply called it the pestilence, the great mortality, or that thing that keeps killing literally everyone we know. You arrive at a hilltop shrine built from stacked stones and half-crumbled saints. Someone scrawled in charcoal on one pillar. Not death, just the end of breath. You sit there for a while, letting that soak in, because maybe the real mystery of the Black Death isn't just who or what caused it. Maybe it's what it was. For over 100 years, we assumed it was bubonic plague, caused by Yersinia pestis, spread by fleas on rats. But here's where the plague gets fussy. Some symptoms don't match. Some regions had mass death without the characteristic buboes, those swollen lymph nodes under arms and in groins. Others had people dying within 24 hours, gasping, bleeding from the nose without a bite or blemish in sight. In Iceland, yes, let's take a detour. There were no rats at all in the 14th century, and yet people still died of something that sounded a whole lot like plague. You pass a trader's stone shelter with books piled like bricks near the hearth. One is open to a page marked with a feather. The fever took her in hours. She coughed red, then could not speak. We burned the sheets. The cat stayed with her until the end. Still no mention of rats. Still no mention of bites. So let's shake things up with tonight's quirky tidbit. Some researchers have proposed alternative causes for the Black Death, including viral hemorrhagic fever, anthrax outbreaks, or even a disease we've never encountered since. Why? Because some symptoms and transmission patterns don't quite match what we know Yersinia pestis to do. Historians still argue whether the 14th century plague was uniquely virulent, a hybrid of diseases, or a bacterium behaving badly under unknown conditions. You walk down a path once carved by mule trains and wind. You find a monastery carved into the rock. Windows like eye sockets, the door gaping. The monks are long gone, but their records remain. You flip through vellum scrolls, hand-copied Latin phrases with elegant gloom. And though the rats were fat and thriving, the novices all perished in song. You raise an eyebrow, you enter. The dormitory, beds made of straw, now mouldy and still. No sign of rats. Just scraps of cloth, rosaries on windowsills, and a single cracked censer. The air tastes like cedar and something sourer. You don't cough. You step outside and catch the sun just right. It lights the valley in gold, makes everything seem soft. Even the memory of death feels gentler from a distance, and here's your scholarly seasoning. In 2001, researchers recovered plague DNA from medieval skeletons, confirming that Yersinia pestis was indeed present during the Black Death, but it wasn't the same as modern strains. Genetic analysis shows it may have mutated rapidly or combined with environmental conditions to act very differently than any plague we know today. Historians still argue whether it was a superstrain, a dual infection, or a phenomenon will never fully explain. You sit beside a stream trickling through the stones. You wash your hands with cold water, watching it swirl with flecks of soil and memories. The wind rustles your cloak. Insects buzz nearby. One lands on your arm. You flick it away instinctively. It's never just the bite. It's what comes with it. You think back to every theory you've heard. Rats, fleas, breath, cloth, God, punishment, stars. Maybe all of them, maybe none. Maybe the plague was less a thing and more a reaction to overpopulation, to climate, to stress, to trade, to war. A system collapse dressed in symptoms. And the rats? They were just there, watching, nibbling, waiting for us to find someone else to blame. You leave the monastery at first light. The air is clear, thin, and oddly still. No bird song, no foot traffic. Just your own boots crunching frost as you make your way back down into the valley below. You pass stone walls that once guarded sheep. The sheep are gone. The walls remain. It's peaceful, in that unnerving way that only abandoned places can be. And tonight, you're finally meeting the real villain. No, not the rats, not the fleas, not the air. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium at the heart of the plague. Tiny, invisible, unknowable for centuries. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Yersinia pestis is the bacteria responsible for plague, first identified in 1894 by Alexandre Yersin during an outbreak in Hong Kong. It's been confirmed as the cause of the Black Death through DNA recovered from plague burial sites, making it one of the few medieval mysteries where science and history now shake hands. You stop beside a muddy path where 3 carts have been abandoned. One still has bundles of hay, another a barrel of apples gone to vinegar, and the third empty. Just a cloth stained dark and stiff with time. You step around it carefully, because here's the weird part. Yersinia pestis is a pretty bad traveller. It dies quickly outside of hosts, doesn't do well in heat or sunlight, and needs a flea or bodily fluid to get anywhere meaningful. And yet, it managed to travel thousands of miles, leap from human to human, city to city, without a modern understanding of germ theory or sanitation. That's not just sinister, it's impressive. You reach a hilltop shrine overlooking a fork in the road, north to Krakow, east to Constantinople. On the back of the shrine, someone has carved a crude map marking outbreaks with X's. The path is covered in them. You sit and pull from your satchel the vial the Samarkand monk gave you. The flea inside is long dead, but the symbolism is very much alive. You shake it. It doesn't answer. Now for your quirky tidbit, Yersinia pestis has multiple transmission routes. Bubonic through flea bites, pneumonic through airborne droplets,
and septicemic through direct contact with infected blood. This versatility is what makes it so dangerous.
Some scholars believe that multiple forms were active during the Black Death, confusing medieval observers and making it almost impossible to trace a consistent pattern. Historians still argue whether this polymorphic behavior explains the speed and scale of the outbreak. You walk into the next village, a fishing town once thriving. Nets hang useless from posts. Boats float half-sunk near the pier. And yet the storage huts are intact. You slip inside one, finding baskets of salt, barrels of pickled herring and, oddly, herbs tied in little bunches along the ceiling beams. And in one corner, a crate marked with the faint, hand-scrawled letters. Zati, you pause. Someone here knew the name, maybe not the microbe, but the pattern. You open the crate, inside. Cloth, linen, wool, a velvet sleeve. All untouched. No rats, no rot. But perhaps the
damage was already done. You find a ledger near the hearth. The tailor coughed for hours.
His daughter took the bolts of cloth to the next town. Now both are gone. So are their customers. You shut the book. This disease didn't care for cause and effect. It wasn't interested in tidy crime scenes or identifiable suspects. It was chaos, wrapped in the disguise of routine. A handshake, a shared cup, a shoulder brushed in a crowd. You head toward the docks where the water laps softly. And here comes your scholarly seasoning. Yersinia pestis evolved over centuries, mutating and shifting between pandemics. The strain responsible for the Black Death differs genetically from the one that caused the Justinian plague 800 years earlier, and from the third pandemic that began in 19th century China. Scientists continue to track these changes through ancient DNA. Historians still argue whether the Black Death strain was uniquely lethal, or if its unprecedented destruction had more to do with social collapse than biology. You sit on the dock's
edge, watching the water. The sea doesn't reflect the sky tonight. It's dark and a little too still. A rat scurries along a rope nearby.
You both ignore each other. For once, the suspicion has lifted. You look out at the horizon and imagine ships carrying not rats or grain, but bacteria, hiding in lungs and fibers and droplets, passed from hand to hand like a cursed heirloom. You whisper the name Yersinia pestis, so small, so efficient, and so misunderstood for so long. You stand, dust off your cloak, and leave the dock behind. Not because you're done learning, but because now you know what you're really up against. And
it's not the squeak in the wall, it's what rides on the breath.
You spend the morning walking through meadows dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stone ruin. The air is fresh, crisp, deceptively clean, as if nature, indifferent to human suffering, is simply going about its business. It's easy to forget, in a place like this, that a plague ever passed through. But then you see it. A mound, overgrown with grass and nettles, surrounded by crooked wooden stakes. No markings. No names. Just a mass grave, too weary to bother pretending. You stand in silence. It's not the first you've seen, and it won't be the last. But this one is different, because it's the final resting place of a town that never had rats. Tonight, you've arrived at the coldest corner of the Black Death's mystery, the plague-free rat zones that weren't plague-free at all. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Certain regions like Iceland, parts of Norway, and several alpine villages had no black rat populations during the 14th century, and yet they experienced significant outbreaks of the Black Death. This breaks the entire rat-flea-human triangle you've been following for 18 sections. And it forces a new question. How did the plague arrive where the rats could not? You enter what's left of a mountain village. Stone cottages, moss-covered roofs, a well that's gone dry. You step inside a hut where two chairs face each other. One still holds a spindle of yarn. The other a pile of folded clothes, no rats, no scratchings, just dust, cold air, and something heavier in the silence. A journal lies on the hearthstone. He returned from Bergen with sore throat. He drank broth, then stopped speaking. We never saw a rat. But the fever spread house to house, faster than the wind, faster than wind. No rodents, no travellers since. You walk back outside. A breeze whistles through the trees. It carries no fleas. Just questions. Quirky tidbit tonight. Rats are not native to Iceland, and there's no evidence of widespread infestation during the 14th century. Yet Icelandic records clearly describe plague-like outbreaks, so severe that entire farms were left abandoned for generations. Historians still argue whether these were misidentified diseases, or if the plague didn't need rats at all. You meet a shepherd walking the high trails. He wears a fox fur coat and carries a slingshot. When
Asked if plague came here, he nods once. We had no grain, no ships, no rats, he says.
But we had visitors. They didn't stay long. You imagine the scene, a trader, coughing lightly, sharing a meal, leaving before nightfall. Days later, coughs, fevers, funerals, and here comes your scholarly seasoning. Modern research suggests that human ectoparasites, fleas and lice that live on people and in clothing, may have been the real vectors in rat-free zones. Unlike rat fleas, these parasites don't need animals at all. They ride quietly in seams and sleeves, transmitting bacteria directly from person to person. Historians still argue whether these clothing fleas explain the plague's reach into isolated, rodent-free communities. You pause at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a river that carves the land like a patient knife. A small, wooden bridge spans the water, half collapsed. Still beautiful. You walk across it, feeling the planks bend beneath your boots. On the far side, another village waits, empty but intact. The doors are shut, the windows shuttered. But the signs are there, red marks on thresholds, burned bedding in the square, herbs tied in clumps on doorposts. Someone fought this and lost. You enter the town hall. A message is scratched into the long table. We washed, we burned, we prayed.
But we did not see them coming. You run your fingers over the words. The grooves are deep. Desperate. Not a word about rats. Not a scratch, not a chewed rope, nothing. Just the silence left by a disease that knew how to arrive uninvited and stay.
Too long. You step outside and look at the horizon, valleys, rivers, glaciers, sky. Too remote for rats, too cold for fleas, and still the Black Death came. You wrap your cloak tighter, because if rats were the excuse and fleas were the guess, then breath, cloth, and company were the truth. And the enemy was never out there in the walls. It was already sitting beside you. You walk until nightfall, until the wind quiets and the stars begin to soften the edges of the world. The road fades into packed earth, then into moss, then into silence. You find a place to rest near the ruins of what might have been a small chapel. The roof is gone, but the stone walls remain, low, weather-worn and comfortingly solid. You sit beside what used to be the altar, and for the first time in days, you allow yourself to exhale fully. You've reached the edge of the mystery, and what you've found is that the trail didn't lead to rats. It led to us, to breath, to skin, to cloth passed from hand to hand, to air held too long between strangers in close rooms. The rats were never the point. They were simply the nearest shape we could blame, because the real truth is harder. So tonight, we wind down. No more running. No more questions, just quiet now. The stars are clearer in this part of the world, like frost sprinkled over black silk. You lie back on the stone floor, looking up through where the chapel's roof used to be. Above you, the sky doesn't ask what you've learned. It already knows. You think about everyone you met on this strange, quiet journey. The baker with the fever, the apothecary with the glass vial, the tailor's child with the toy, the monk who handed you a dead flea, the man by the river who never once mentioned rats, and the rat, of course, the one who looked up from the bread crust and blinked at you, who survived through all of it. Perhaps the real twist in this story is that we blamed the one who outlived
Us. You close your eyes, letting your mind drift across the centuries, to the ships, the markets, the monasteries, the caravans winding like ink across the skin of the world. All of it connected.
all of it vulnerable. You imagine the breath of a coughing merchant, the cloth-wrapped flea in a carpet bundle, the whisper of a prayer over an open grave. Soft sounds, human sounds, not the scratching of vermin, but the echo of footsteps, choices, fear, and closeness. You roll to one side, arms tucked under your head. The stone is cold, but not unfriendly. Above, the stars continue their quiet patrol. And somewhere in the distance, you think you hear a cartwheel turning slowly. Or, maybe not, maybe it's just the world remembering. Good night, traveller. You've walked far, and though we never found a single rat we could convict, what we did find was something else, a reminder that not every mystery has a villain. Some just have humans doing what we've always done. Moving, touching, surviving until we don't, so rest now. The questions can wait. Let the wind carry your last thoughts gentle and unhurried, past fields that once echoed with fear and into a night that no longer needs
answers. Sleep. Knowing you walked the same paths they did and you made it through.
The next morning arrives like a sigh, soft, reluctant, and almost forgetful. Mist clings low to the ground, tracing the paths of streams and foot-worn roads as if retracing history itself. You rise slowly, joints stiff from stone sleep. The world feels lighter now, not because anything has changed, but because you have. There's a stillness in your step, the quiet knowing that the plague isn't just a disease, or a timeline, or a theory about fleas. It's a story we've told, ourselves for centuries, and sometimes we got the characters wrong. Today, you set your sights on what came after the deaths, the reshaping, the subtle realignments. The city maps redrawn not by architects, but by absence, because the plague didn't just kill people, it rewrote the cities they left behind. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After the Black Death, many medieval cities saw significant changes in urban planning. Narrow alleys were widened, cemeteries moved outside city walls. Water systems, sanitation, and waste management began, slowly, to improve. The trauma of the plague became a blueprint for healthier, more breathable cities. You arrive at the outskirts of a walled town being rebuilt. The bells are ringing, but not for funerals this time. For labour, Newstone arrives by ox cart. Streets are being cleared. A public fountain is under construction, not just for beauty, but for clean water. It's easy to miss in the grandeur of cathedrals and castles, but the humble fountain was one of the quiet revolutions of the post-plague world. You sit near it, watching a mason chip away at a lion's head spout. He tells you, after the sickness, people stopped trusting the wells. They wanted to see the water move. You nod. That feels fair. Nearby, an alley has been closed with timber boards. A new passage is being carved through what used to be 3 homes. One man says, "Too tight." The sickness stayed in the corners. Turns out, fear has an architectural style. Quirky tidbit. In London and Milan, some of the first major public health ordinances appeared after the Black Death, banning certain building styles, requiring wider roads, and separating butcher shops from residences. These were the early ancestors of modern city zoning. Historians still argue whether these changes were driven by fear, logic, or sheer exhaustion. You stroll past a wall where someone has painted a map of the towns before and after. It's not pretty, but it's clear the city has fewer houses now, more empty spaces, and new routes carved like veins through what once felt suffocating. Even death, it seems, can be an urban designer. You climb a bell tower, still under repair. From the top, the town looks different, not just smaller, but simpler. The streets are straighter, the stalls are better spaced. The graveyard has been moved outside the gates. You remember how, at the height of the plague, bodies were buried wherever there was room. Orchards, courtyards, even beneath kitchen floors. That chaos didn't just haunt the living, it reshaped the land. You pause by a tailor's shop now reopened. He's displaying linen masks, not for plague, but for dust. Still, you wonder if the instinct to cover the face ever really left. And here comes your scholarly seasoning. Some researchers believe that post-plague architectural and health reforms set the foundation for the modern public health movement, not through centralized government, but through collective trauma. Cities became more aware of space, proximity, and infrastructure. Historians still argue whether the plague forced innovation or just made it impossible to avoid anymore. You stop at a courtyard where children are playing. Real laughter, not echoes. One of them runs up to you, handing you a pebble. "It's
Magic," she says. "Keeps you from getting sick." You take it. Why not? You wander through a rebuilt market, noting wider stalls, cleaner surfaces, more fresh herbs.
The vendors still believe in mint and sage, maybe now for aroma instead of exorcism, maybe not. In a bakery, the ovens are new. The baker tells you, "We built it with more windows, air's important now." You nod again. Yes, air is important. Now, you stand in the center of the square and close your eyes. There are no rats, no fleas, just voices, tools, hammers, music, somewhere faint. This isn't a plague city anymore, it's a post-plague city. The bones are still there, buried underfoot. But the buildings have changed. The breath of the people, the flow of the roads, even the shape of grief, different now. And perhaps that's the quiet miracle, not that we survived, but that we used the shape of the loss to build something with more light. You spend the next day walking, not aimlessly, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. There's something peculiar about post-plague towns. A tension between grief and momentum. They rebuild not because they want to, but because they must. And as you wander farther into the countryside, you begin to notice a subtler shift. The conversations have changed. People are talking less about sickness, and more about money. Not in the greedy way, in the survival way. How much to dig a well? How much to buy a new ox? How much to pay a shepherd, now that there are fewer of them? Tonight's theme, the rise of wages and the slow crumble of serfdom. Because if the Black Death devastated Europe's population, it also, almost accidentally, reshaped its economy. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After the Black Death, Europe experienced a severe labour shortage. With so many workers gone, peasants and artisans found themselves in rare demand. And for the first time in centuries, they began demanding wages, mobility, and freedom from feudal obligations. Many historians consider this the beginning of the end for serfdom in Western Europe. You enter a village that's bustling, not with joy, exactly, but with something like agency. People are moving bricks, ploughing fields, opening shutters with less fear. You sit beside a stonemason resting between loads. He hands you a hunk of bread. "They're paying me now," he says. "Didn't used to, just fed me slop and called."
Duty. You ask what changed. He gestures around him. All the men who'd have replaced me are gone. His tone is flat, not cruel. Just honest. It's a strange kind of empowerment, the kind built on the bones of neighbours. Further down,
The road. A young woman tends a garden that clearly used to be a cabbage field. Now it's full of herbs, strawberries, even a few stalks of what looks like wild barley. "I bought this land," she says. "My lord didn't come back. His son didn't want it. I paid 3 hens and a promise to keep the weeds down." You smile. It's not quite a revolution, but it's definitely reallocation. And here's your quirky tidbit. After the plague, many nobles tried to reimpose old feudal duties, insisting that peasants still owed unpaid labor. In response, entire villages walked off estates, choosing to settle elsewhere and work for wages. This led to peasant revolts, including the famous 1381 uprising in England. Historians still argue whether these revolts were about justice, survival, or simply seizing an opportunity that death had made possible. You stop at a village green where a group of young men are negotiating with an elder over firewood prices. One says, "I'm not cutting it for less than 3 pennies. Find another boy." There's no fear in his voice, no deference, just negotiation. You move on. At a manor house half-burned and overgrown, you see sheep grazing freely. The fields, once worked by dozens of labourers, are empty of people, but wool, that's still growing. And here's your scholarly seasoning. The Black Death led to a massive shift from labour-intensive agriculture to pastoral farming, especially in England. Sheep required fewer workers, and wool was valuable. This transition changed not only the landscape, but the structure of rural economies. Historians still argue whether this was an act of practical adaptation or quiet abandonment. In the next town, you pass a group of former servants now running a bakery together. They don't wear uniforms, they don't ask permission, they bake, sell, and pocket the coin. One of them, a boy no older than 14, winks at you and says, "You don't need a lord if you have good bread." Hard to argue with that. You take a seat under a tree near the market square. It's modest but alive. Trade is picking up. Goods are changing hands. Silver clinks. Hens argue in baskets. Someone is laughing. Not loudly, but really laughing. You watch 2 children run by, one chasing the other with a dandelion crown. They don't mention the plague. They don't even seem to know it happened. And maybe that's the surest sign of all that the world is changing. The disease took half the
population, but the people who remained,
They're asking for more money, more land, more say, less silence, less fear, and fewer lords telling them what their lives are worth. You stretch your legs and lean back against the tree, and for the first time since your journey began, you feel something warm settle deep in your chest. It's not joy, it's not grief. It's the knowledge that systems, even ancient ones, can break. And from the break, something else can grow. You rise early the next morning, but this time not from urgency, just habit. The wind is softer, the air smells of dew and warm earth. And for once, your footsteps are met not by echoes or silence, but by the rhythmic beat of hammers, the clatter of buckets, the chatter of people who are building again. But amid all this slow resurrection, you start to notice something else, something quieter, almost invisible unless you're looking for it. A certain tiredness in the soil, a kind of emptiness in the houses that weren't rebuilt. Tonight's theme: the plague didn't end, it just learned how to come back, quieter. Because while the Black Death of the 1340s was the largest and most shocking outbreak, it was not the last, not by a long shot. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After the first catastrophic wave of the Black Death, 1347-1352, plague continued to return every 10 to 20 years in smaller but deadly waves across Europe and the wider world. These outbreaks persisted for over 3 centuries, shaping generations and reinforcing the memory of the first great mortality. You pass a town square where a fountain is being scrubbed. The stone is clean, but faded letters remain etched into its base. Second wave, 1361, 8 families gone. And beneath that, another, 1374, lost the baker. Again. It's the again that catches your breath. You find an old man sweeping his doorway, whistling tunelessly. You ask if he remembers the second wave. He stops, leans on the broom. I remember the third, he says. By then we stopped counting years by harvests, counted them by burials. You walk through a half-rebuilt hamlet. One half gleams with new timber, fresh cob. The other half is skeletal, roofs caved in, walls open to the weather, windows staring blankly. They didn't come back after the second plague, someone tells you, or the third. Quirky tidbit tonight. In many parts of Europe, chroniclers recorded plague years in the margins of family Bibles, often noting which children, servants, or animals had died. These notes reveal patterns. The plague didn't just vanish, it became a familiar seasonal threat, like drought or war. Historians still argue whether these repeat outbreaks were due to persistent local reservoirs or fresh reintroductions via trade. You find yourself walking next to a field that once held dozens of small homes. Only foundations remain now, filled. With wildflowers and bees, a woman nearby gathers lavender and sage into neat bundles. This is where my grandmother's street used to be, she says. Only 2 of them came back. The rest moved to the city, or the grave. You ask if it ever really went away. She smiles, sad and small. No, it just got quieter. You enter a church that's strangely well preserved. The pews are worn, but clean. Candles flicker in the corner. A priest kneels at the altar, whispering something. A child sleeps on a bench nearby, bundled in a blanket stitched with small embroidered X's. You don't need to ask what they mean. Here comes your scholarly seasoning. Modern studies of plague. DNA in human remains suggest that distinct strain of Yersinia pestis recurred in waves, some more deadly than others. Cities with good quarantine enforcement, like Milan or Dubrovnik, suffered fewer repeat outbreaks, while trade hubs and port towns were repeatedly hit. Historians still argue whether Europe ever truly eliminated plague reservoirs or merely learned to live alongside them. You pause at a river, watching laundry ripple in the current. A group of women scrub in silence. One says, "We built new
roads after the first plague, but we built habits after the second."
She means hand-washing, isolation, the instinct to turn away at a cough. You feel it too, even now, even centuries later, in a story told slowly at the edge of sleep. The Black Death didn't just come and go, it came and stayed. It changed how people lived. But more than that, it changed how people died, and how they imagined dying. A house left empty wasn't just a loss, it was a warning. A street too quiet wasn't just peaceful, it was suspicious. A stranger's arrival meant more than trade, it might mean a funeral. And that's perhaps the cruelest legacy, not the numbers, not the bones, but the fact that plague trained generations to expect return. You stand at the edge of a field and look out at a landscape scarred with both memory and regrowth. The plague is not here now, but it was, and it could be. And that thought, it lingers like breath on cold glass. The morning is grey, but not sad. You walk through a narrow lane where vines grow freely across doorways that were never unbarred again. The stones beneath your feet remember more footsteps than they currently host. But in the quiet, there's peace. People have stopped waiting for the next wave. They've started living with the knowledge that another could come. And tonight, you're listening to that echo. How societies survive by adapting, not in sudden revolutions, but in quiet recalibrations of daily life. Because the plague didn't only alter death, it altered rhythm. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the centuries following the initial Black Death, plague became a recurring part of life. Families created contingency plans. Cities adopted public health protocols. Businesses built plague clauses into contract. Entire cultures learned to breathe differently, with caution, superstition, and strange little rituals we now call tradition. You pass through a market where every stall is spaced just a little further apart than seems necessary. The seller of onions has a sign, no touching, point and I'll pass it. No rats in sight, no fear in the air, just routine. You enter a scribe's shop. The clerk wears gloves, not for fashion, but because his father did. You ask when that started.
2 plagues ago, he says. One stuck. In a school, children recite songs that double as hygiene rules. Don't share cups, boil your water.
If someone sneezes, say a prayer and take 3 steps back. Quirky tidbit. In Venice, during plague years, boats had to anchor offshore for 40 days. The origin of the word quarantine, from 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Over. Time. This concept expanded beyond harbours, evolving into broader strategies. Don't crowd, wash hands, wait it out. Historians still argue whether medieval cities fully understood disease vectors or whether they simply noticed what seemed to work. You take a seat at the edge of a communal oven. It's still warm from morning bread. An older woman dusts flour from her apron. I remember the plague, she says. Well, my grandmother's version. They made masks from birch bark, hung rosemary at the windows, stopped singing indoors. She shrugs. We sing outside now. Always have. You wander past a well where children draw water using long ropes. One spills a bit and panics, grabbing time to rub on her hands. Her brother says, "It's okay. We have sage too." There's no fear in their voices, just inheritance. You visit a guild hall where merchants hang cured herbs from the rafters. Not for luck, not for scent, just because we keep them up, one man says, all for the same reason we close the shutters when someone coughs. You don't need to ask why. It's not fear, it's muscle memory. Here comes your scholarly seasoning. Some anthropologists suggest that post-plague behavior patterns, from food storage to family spacing to religious processions, represent a long-term psychological adaptation to trauma. Even after the threat faded, the habits lingered. Historians still argue whether these were conscious public health measures or subconscious survival rituals passed through generations. You reach the edge of town by dusk. Here, a small circle of stones marks what was once a plague garden, a place where herbs were grown, air was cleared, and the sick were sent to breathe. It's overgrown now, but still tended. Someone has left a sprig of mint in the centre, next to a folded scrap of linen. A note is pinned, under a stone for the ones who stayed home and the ones who didn't. You sit beside it for a while, not mourning, not researching, just listening to what the wind carries when the world is between breaths. This was never about rats, not really. They were part of the story, yes. But the deeper tale, the one that survived even the fleas, was about how people change and how those changes settle into the bones of a culture, into how we greet each other, how we pass bread, how we open windows, how we teach our children to pause when someone sneezes, and how we remember without always realizing we're remembering. You lie back in the grass and stare at the darkening sky. A single crow flaps past. You don't flinch. We've lived with worse. You don't move for a long while. The sun has dipped below the distant ridgeline, casting everything in the soft, bluish grey that only seems to exist in the hour between full day and honest night. Crickets have begun their quiet clicking in the underbrush. Somewhere in the distance, a cart creaks gently across cobblestones, and still you lie there, because you've finally reached it, the end of the trail. Not the end of plague or pain or history. Those things never end, but you've reached the final thread in the strange, stubborn tapestry woven by those who did not die. And you're beginning to realize the real mystery isn't how the Black Death began. It's how people managed to keep going. Tonight's final chapter isn't a dramatic twist or a grand finale. It's a quieter kind of marvel. How the most devastating event in medieval history gradually turned into something ordinary. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 1600s, plague had mostly faded from Western Europe. Some credit improvements in quarantine laws, shifts in climate, or the mysterious disappearance of plague-carrying black rat populations. Others note rising immunity or the role of competing diseases like smallpox and typhus. But the real end, hard to pin down. You sit up slowly and trace a finger along the ground. The soil is rich here, dark. It's been turned many times by farmers, grave diggers, gardeners, and sheep hooves. It's survived everything. You wander into the last village. On your map, it's not marked by gates or statues, but by a smell. Baking bread, a clean hearth, lavender water poured on flagstones to keep the dust down. No one wears masks anymore, but they still nod at you like they know what you've seen. Because maybe they do. You pass a shop window where a girl is mending an old wool tunic. On the wall behind her, a faded banner reads, "In memory of the 1349 dead and the 1391 and the 1421 and the rest." Quirky tidbit, in Marseille, the final major European plague outbreak occurred in 1720, nearly 4 centuries after the Black's Death began. Despite early containment efforts, it killed over 100,000 people. Yet even in its final acts, the plague was met with systems, strategies, and an eerie familiarity. It left the continent not with screams, but with a sigh. You step into a chapel where no priest is preaching, only silence, and a line of candles lit by visitors who leave no names. One flame flickers a little longer than the rest, and you watch it, just a tiny defiance in the darkness. Outside, a man feeds pigeons and tells you softly, "The rats? They were passengers. The fear, that was ours." You nod, because he's right. Historians still argue whether rats truly carried the blame unjustly. Recent studies suggest that human fleas and lice, not rats, may have played the bigger role in spreading the disease, but the narrative stuck because people needed something visible, something to point at, something to fear besides themselves. And that may be the plague's greatest trick. It wasn't just a disease of bodies, it was a disease of blame. You walk out of the village and into the open hills, and for the first time in this long, slow story, you feel the horizon stretch without threat. It's still out there, of course. The next fear, the next mystery, the next misunderstood chapter, but not tonight. Tonight you've made it through one of the worst things history ever threw at humanity, and it come out the other side with a bag full of odd facts, a head full of quiet sorrow, and a heart full of oddly calming trivia. The rats didn't do it, but the people, they didn't give up. And that's what matters. You've done enough wandering for tonight, so go ahead, let your limbs grow heavier. Let the map in your mind slowly fold itself closed. You've walked through centuries, listened to the whispers of old cities, peeked into kitchens where nothing but silence and sage remain. You've watched the rhythms of life shift, not in explosions but in shuffles, small rebuildings, bread baked with fewer hands. There's no need to remember every date or every debate. You've carried the weight of history in your bones tonight, and now it's time to set it down. The world you just travelled through was full of loss, but also survival. Ordinary survival, the kind that brews tea instead of speeches, that plants herbs outside a shuttered window, that keeps going because there's bread to bake and children to hush. You're safe now. You've reached the part of the story where nothing dramatic happens, where the wind just brushes the grass in steady loops, where even the rats have left the frame. Let that quiet sink in. Let your breath match the rhythm of those who kept living, even when no one told them how. Let your eyes fall closed as the story folds gently into itself. You're part of it now. You always were. Good night, traveler. And thank you for listening.